thank you all for being with us. This is the last session, and it's titled Responsive Landscape. I was asked to host this, and my name is Alan Sayek. I'm at the Department of Architecture, and I know something about responsiveness, but I don't know much about landscape. Just to situate this in today's conversations, since Charles this morning mentioned some people might disagree or confused with the titles of these sessions, I would like just to give a sentence or two about what we mean by responsive landscape, responsive environments, let's say. Responsive environments is a term that's becoming more and more, it's almost a household term now, interactivity and responsiveness. And it became possible with the advancement of technologies in the last decade or so, even more in the last 15 years, with having different types of sensors and actuators and output devices getting smaller and smaller with basically technological advances. And so basically what we mean with responsive environments is this idea of building environments or creating environments using these technologies, physical spaces, and most importantly, human interaction and human input, both cognitively, as defined by the cyberneticians almost 50, 60 years ago, and physically, to create more expressive or smart spaces and environments. And I think our speakers today will touch on both of these subjects. And I would like to talk more about this. And so basically I'll introduce our...
I just wanted to amplify on what
yes.
you said. I think there's a general corollary available that by the time an adjectival modifier gets to landscape, it's no longer relevant in most of the other fields because it's taken so long. Right?
The respondent on this panel is going to be Ben Aranda. And Ben is currently teaching Option Studio at the GST, and is the principal of Aranda Lash, a New York-based architectural studio dedicated to experimental research and innovative building. Established in 2003 by Ben Aranda and Chris Lash, the studio designs buildings, installations, and objects through deep investigation of materials and structures. Winners of the United States Artist Award and Young Architects Award in 2007, their early architectural projects are the subject of the book pamphlet Architecture No. 27, Tooling. Aranda Lash has exhibited their work internationally in galleries and institutions dealing with design and architecture. In 2008, they were commissioned by the MoMA in New York to produce a large-scale installation in the museum. They collaborated with Matthew Ritchie on the Morning Line, a work commissioned by TBA 21 that has traveled to Venice, Seville, Istanbul, and Vienna. In addition to commercial and residential projects in New York, they completed a 42,000 square foot temporary structure for Design Miami in 2009. Aranda Lash were featured in both 2008 and 2010 Venice Architectural Biennales. Aranda Lash continually develop experimental furniture products that explore new concepts in fabrication and assembly, are represented by Johnson Trading Gallery in New York. We have a slight change in schedule. The first speaker is going to be Rodolfo Kury. Rodolfo Kury is a principal in the design firm Kury Levitt Fong. He is the author of numerous critically acclaimed books in architectural history and theory, and a regular contributor to professional and academic journals. His books include Monolithic Architecture, Architecture in Fashion, Shaping the City, Studies in History, Theory, and Urban Design, and See Through Le Doux, architecture, theater, and pursuit of transparency. He has received several awards and international recognition for his design work as principal at Office DA, Rec Productions, and currently at KLF Kury. Kury is particularly interested in architectural applications for advanced information technology, aiming for enhanced responsiveness and sustainability in the built environment. His talk is conveniently called Responsive Landscape.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here as part of this discussion, although my relationship to landscape is very tenuous, as you can see from the first slide. You know, I have something green and a floral pattern. But I will try to argue for the relevance of the work. So I would like to show you the work that we are doing at RAD. It's a design-based research unit that we recently initiated at the University of Toronto, which I co-direct with Carol Heiber. And the lab is dedicated to these things that you have heard about and which have already come up in the discussion today: Internet of Things, pervasive computing, ambient intelligence, etc. All basically pointing in the same direction from different perspectives, and basically to the fact that due to the, as Alan mentioned, the proliferation of microchips, ever smaller and cheaper, that computing is migrating from the dedicated appliances to become more and more integrated into objects and environments. So we can actually, this is our formula for the work we do, and really, I mean, it describes almost everything. What happens, basically it says, what happens when you add some computational power or an IP address, some form of communication and intelligence to the building blocks of architecture. And I mean, here, of course, rhetorically, we are choosing the lowliest of all the brick. But for the purpose of this discussion today, I made this new diagram. Better, this one. Because I think things get more trickier and more interesting when we are hybridizing these artificial responsive systems with living ones. This is, I think, where the potential is in the landscape. So I'm going to go through quickly some of the themes that drive the work, and also these become opportunities to show you some of the projects, to give you an idea of what we do. So, of course, the real-time responsiveness of these systems is ideally suited for managing the environmental dynamics. As you know, the thermostat is one of the earliest examples and still perhaps one of the most successful. And in this case, I'm showing you responsive inflatable insulation system, actually, which in real time can vary the R value of the wall to not only to better insulate or more intelligently insulate, but also to sectionally vary that value so that actually we can generate airflows within the room. This is a project. This is a responsive truss which in real time can react to eccentric loads. But what's interesting here is that each structural member is responding individually to local loading conditions picked up by local sensors. So the overall geometry and behavior emerges from the collection of the local responses. This kind of bottom-up distributed organization is something that qualifies, I think, most of the work that we do. Also, these systems, the technology is very perfectly suited for mass customization, or for the accommodation of personal needs within collective settings. Like, for instance, on the left, installation in a gallery where the images projected become yours. Actually, it picks up your photo stream from Flickr as you approach the gallery, or on the right, a brain-to-computer interface which actually changes the lighting in the room according to mood. This has come up already today, the possibility of modulating and calibrating more precisely non-visual and non-substantial aspects of the environment. This is automated for some reason. Of the environment. Here, this is like it's an acoustical tile on steroids, basically, which can be very finely calibrated to modulate the acoustical space. And ambiance and atmosphere does not mean only mood, but also means, in this case, literally the possibility of intervening in the quality and the composition of the air, such as in this modular living wall that is electronically controlled to help assist in the environmental systems of the building. Okay, so these are some of the themes. Now I want to show you an example in greater detail. This is a piece which was done in collaboration with Carol Heiber and Christos Markopoulos of M-1 Studio. And it was commissioned by Workshop, which is a gallery in Toronto dedicated to the kind of cultural exchange between China and Toronto. And the brief, they asked us basically to project or envision embroidery for the 21st century. And what we proposed basically is a blanket which has an IP address, basically, and which has a capacity for self-representation and positioning. So basically, you play with this, you pull it up, and then it represents itself in the digital environment. We can imagine all kinds of applications for this, perhaps monitoring sleep disorders, etc. But what for me was most interesting is that most fundamental capacity for self-representation. That's enough. And how is that done? It's with this hexagrid of very low-tech tilt sensors that we actually produced ourselves, which relay data from, you can see here a close-up, which has to do with the variation in the resistance of the current. Depending on where this tassel falls, the resistance in the current is going to change, and that's enough. That data is enough to create vectors, which then, taking into account other vectors in the neighborhood, are enough to algorithmically extrapolate the whole shape of the blanket in real time. Now, in relation to the discussion we had earlier about pattern and performance, I mean, it could have been this, really, but it became that. And there's a decorative impulse which I will not disavow, but I still want to say that actually the logic that has created this pattern, meaning expanding the pads here to capture the tassel, equidistant connections to the multiplexer here. The logic is not dissimilar to the logic that produces arborescent structures in nature. So the analogy is at that very fundamental level. Here is the blanket. Okay, now if we abstract this and diagram it, and what we're doing basically, and we're going back to the blog, what we're doing is adding some kind of sensing capacity to an element here, and some actuating capacity in this one. And also about the possibility of feedback. In this case, the sensing is basically the angle of that where the tassel is falling, and the actuation, the output, is the data transmitted wirelessly to the computer. This gets more complicated, of course, if you have more than one, and then they start to interfere, and this is only through that interference that actually extrapolation of the overall form is possible, and communication, etc. So what you end up with, basically, is the objects enmeshed in a network of communication, connections, and feedback, which is not unlike the networks we associate with natural ecologies. It's a kind of artificial nature. Hence, actually, the title of the book that we are preparing now for publication, which documents the work that we're doing, is called Make Alive. So, the next piece I'm going to present quickly is actually thematizes this idea of an artificial nature. And of course, I want to say this is tongue-in-cheek. This is nature point of view. As a response, it's a provocation a bit, a response to the brief from the Chengdu Biennale from this last summer, which asked for a kind of visions of an integration of nature and city. So we said, who needs nature? We can create an artificial tree or an artificial forest, of course, and ironically. And that artifice, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with the quoting here from the proposal, the flux of response at myriad scales created through the artificial means of distributed responsive technologies, a fabricated world whose technical ecologies is parallel to that of organic environments. And also the pattern itself of the rotational paraboloid also participated in that illusion and the effect of nature by creating a form which is inscrutable yet still intellectually objectifiable, much like natural, the intricacy of nature. Anyway, but the effect still had to do mostly with all kinds of digital, audiovisual, electronically macro-controlled devices which provided acoustical feedback to the movement of viewers. This is all fiber optics with creating flickering light, which approximates the experience of like walking through foliage. And here, even a scent diffuser with a scent that was designed by smell artist Cecil Tolas to evoke nature. So this is it, and we noticed very quickly that actually the very kind of low-tech effect of the light reflecting on the plastic was more interesting than our elaborate, like, electronically firing lasers. And here, there was a lesson that finally the real, actually, and the complexity of natural phenomena are always more, at least in this case, more interesting than the artifice that imitates them. So we get to the real, and here's the scent garden that I want to show you. It's a commission from the International Horticultural Expo in Xi'an. Xi'an is one of the second-tier cities in China, and there's a huge new area which was slated now for development, and it has a very environmentally friendly mandate, which is actually was framed and launched within Horticultural Expo. Okay, quickly. So this is the master plan, and our site is here, which is in a valley, and it's like a big drain for this area, and which constituted an interesting design challenge for us, which I will not concentrate on. But here it is. It's a very simple system of alleys of trees and planting beds and benches, and with also a grid of scent poles, which double also as lighting fixtures. This is the plan. Larger and denser planting here, and a more looser, lower area for collecting the crowd and for resting. Skip. this is what it's supposed to look like. But again, what's most important is that for this discussion is this kind of the infrastructure here, which is designed to deliver what Sean was talking about this morning, this kind of non-substantial architecture that has to do with gradients of auras or energies rather than precisely the delineated forms. And in this case, it's a senscape which is overlaid over the landscape, which is the visual landscape was a material, substantial landscape, was meant to be very, very calm, and actually it was meant to be a relief from the formal orgies all around. And the action, the assault here was not on the eye, but was on the nose. And here is a diagram of how the poles had the motion and proximity sensors and also wind sensors, which participate. I guess this is the early prototype, which initially had a photovoltaic cell for self-powering, but actually the Chinese client didn't like our oversized leaf, and they just powered tubes. And the curation, the orchestration of the scent had followed two distinct but overlapping logic. One was cultural, geographic, and has to do with the mapping of the Chinese biome in this concentrated area. The other one, more flaky perhaps, had to do with was based on aromatherapeutic principles and arranged more supposedly uplifting scents towards the hill and more soothing ones towards the valley. As I mentioned, the poles were also light fixtures, and the light intensified due to the wind sensor intensified when there's a gust of wind, basically translating the propagation of sense into a visual image. Here is that last pavilion is where actually you can buy samples of all of the scents which are delivered in the garden and take them with you as a souvenir. This looked like, it's not exactly how we designed it, but it's close enough. Although we actually did the construction document, but somehow mysteriously didn't. Well, it's good enough, I think. So this is a modest project. It's a folly in the kind of World Expo genre, but you can easily imagine how similar technologies and devices can be deployed more ambitiously in a larger context. I'm showing the Catherine Mosbach and Philippe Ram competition after they won this project in Taiwan, which conceives in more sophisticated ways of electronically mediated microclimates at a larger scale. You can say that this is still in the installation art genre, but given the history of parks and cities, and we know how the parks have influenced cities as basically R&D environments where innovation can grow. But even in our modest way, we intervened in the cycle of the natural cycle of the garden, compensating artificially for the declining scent during the cold months. You can imagine how this is already hinting at a future where a situation where every object, every element is equipped, is networked, and capable of this kind of electronic mediation, and how can this network could be conceived as a non-substantial infrastructure which more actively could participate in shaping those ecological processes. And this is what we intended in this competition entry for a city outside, new city outside Helsinki, where it's like a landscape urbanism on steroids here, where there's a very radical integration of natural and artificial system, which actually would necessitate such technologies for their successful integration. And I think Bradley is going to talk about this now, this kind of the ecological potential of such technology.
Our next speaker is Brad and Bell. Brad is part of of a group of professors dedicated to advancing the science and art of landscape design through computing and data visualization. He actively fosters interdisciplinary research projects and is the director of the Terrain Kinetics TT Lab, an interdisciplinary facility for the exploration of landscape visualization and interactive spaces. His own research and teaching focuses on using digital film and techniques to represent landscape form and phenomenology. This work in digital representation ranges from improving the workflow of digital media in the design process to providing a methodology for deconstructing landscape through compositing and film editing techniques. Another of his research interests is creating interactive landscapes using devices which express site characteristics through ambient cues, a continuation of work started while he was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. This research aims to strengthen designers' analysis and understanding of landscape and the everyday use of space. Design, experimentation, and research is explored through competitions such as Boston Center of the Arts, Bridge Park International Design Competition, finalists in 2005, and Logan Airport 9/11 Memorial Competition finalist 2004. In addition to teaching at LSU, Cantrell teaches new approaches to landscape visualization to design firms throughout the U.S. He lectures at universities and conferences such as the University of Kentucky, University of Rhode Island, Cella, Acadia, and the Red Stick International Animation Festival. He has collaborated on digital media projects and 3D visualizations with MIT, the Rhode Island School of Design, and the Harvard Center for Design Informatics. He is currently principal of Visual Logic Inc., a studio dedicated to landscape visualization, new media, and interactive spaces. His talk is called Cyborg Landscapes, Synthetic Ecologies.
Yes. So, thank you, Al. As Al mentioned, a lot of my research and work is in representation and animation, with another kind of facet of that in this idea of responsive technologies and how that influences ecological systems. I started kind of my interest in that 10 years ago when I was in graduate school, and actually learning from Al and other faculty here. Whenever it used to be called interactive spaces, and we were using Lingo and Director, and so things have changed quite a bit from those days. The idea here, though, is to posit a framework for how we might understand these, what was just mentioned as art installations, as new ways to imagine infrastructure and new ways to basically interact with the complexity of ecological systems. Similar to other respondents and presenters, I can also use a dictionary, so I put some definitions up here for us. The idea here is that all of these words are exactly what they mean, and that's all these 4 slides say, that we are talking about constructed systems or fabricated systems that are about the realities we understand. Ecologies are these biological relationships. And then cyborg landscapes simply are this idea of the integration between the biotic and the abiotic, and how those two come together. So what I'd like to present then is a series of kind of forays into that area. One of them deals with kind of a pedagogy at LSU and the way we're teaching some representation courses, and then goes directly into how we're approaching some of these problems. I have this inordinate fascination with the Mississippi Basin model, and I believe there's a lot to this model. It's shaped a good portion of the infrastructure in our country, and as a system, a tangible system and a heuristic tool, it also taught people a lot about fluid dynamics and how large-scale infrastructure works, as well as this kind of initial foray into performative models. And the basin model itself, if you're unfamiliar with it, is 60-acre model in Clinton, Mississippi. You can actually walk into this model and see the water flowing past you. But it uses a whole series of devices that are now completely in decay that begin to mimic actual natural processes, I guess is the way to say it. The channels are lined with different aggregate and rocks, or they use different types of screws that screw into them in order to mimic different friction coefficients. And it uses all kinds of different wire and things like this to mimic different ground cover. Now, that's not a system that was basically figured out in advance completely, but there's a series of kind of moves that happened that allowed them to take conditions they understood, apply them to this model, and see if the model behaved the way the map and the actual watershed behaved at that time. Once that was figured out, they slowly built this into this kind of somewhat performative model. With that, I'm going to go quickly through this course. But a course at LSU that we've been teaching called Illustrating Ecologies tries to sit somewhere within these two realms. And it sits somewhere between this idea of simulation and representation, but more kind of firmly grounded in illustration. One of the models that we looked at for this course was this Berkeley streambed model, which uses different types of substrates, sand, plastic pellets, gravel, and then alfalfa sprouts growing through that medium, to then basically run water through that and get this kind of meandering stream. Based on the way the alfalfa sprouts decayed, the way the substrate held together, this stream would then basically build itself. And it became not about modeling an actual river that existed, but instead about understanding how these kind of dynamic processes played out. So of course, we had to make our own. It actually gets slightly more impressive than this. The idea here, though, is that the students began to explore this, this substrate and how the plant material holds it together, and then began to build their own version of that. And so they built this large 4x8 model, grew the alfalfa, and turned that into a model that they could then read kind of the scientific discourse about the way the models, or the way the river systems were working. And then they could play that out in their version of that. And while neither exactly lined up with one another, it became a conversation about the tangible and the representation. And so it became this model that sat in a studio that they could constantly work with. The idea with this then is that the students began to take that and explore a series of digital tools, particularly fluid modelers like in fluid dynamics in Maya, as well as particle systems, and they began to then build small versions of what those systems might actually be. While none of them get exactly close to that, the idea, though, is that the particle systems they're building aren't just about what they're necessarily seeing. It's a conversation between sight, scientific literature, and then all of the kind of systems that are working in the software. And as those systems kind of converge, they're able to kind of make a kind of critical, there's a critical discourse that occurs about representation and simulation at that point. And I would say that we were neither failed or were completely successful with this, but it set up, in a sense, a sketching with particle systems that allowed us to talk about the larger systems. What we did end up building, though, was a similar system that generated a particle system of the watershed, a very simple particle system, that then allowed us to insert, so it became this kind of live visualization, allowed us to insert things like dams and locks and see if those systems behave the way the historical generation of the watershed occurred. And so this system then kind of came together as this larger representation. So I'm showing you that as a way to kind of understand the way we're thinking of simulation and representation, which I think dovetails right directly into these kind of responsive technologies. There's 4 technologies that I believe are directly affecting us in our profession, many more kind of ancillary. But in terms of responsive systems, there's this idea of autonomous vehicles and their ability to not only map, but engage directly with the landscape. There's this embedding of sensor systems within the strata that's occurring through geotextiles embedded with sensor systems. And many other kind of ways we're kind of piercing the strata and sensing, building sensing grids, as well as the idea of shared intelligence and networked intelligence, and that we can embed a single intelligence into an object, and their ability to speak to one another allows us to complete much bigger tasks. And kind of off to the side of that is this idea of that was slightly we talked about before in terms of body modification, but also this kind of direct interface with our neural networks and our ability for us to begin to control machinery strictly through our own biology. There are people obviously working in this area. I'd like to think I'm one of them, but individuals like Usman Haig, Philip Beasley, and David Benjamin all are touching around this area. And I would say my work is trying to do something in between all of this, and that is that it's strictly kind of grounded in physical computing. It's kind of all of the same devices we all know and we're working with. It's facilitated by parametric modeling and the ability and things like Jason Johnson and Andy Payne's plugin Firefly to teach, but it's also facilitated by building these art installation projects and allowing those projects to then inform us to speculate on bigger landscapes. One of these projects is a project that was exhibited at Acadia as well as at the LSU College of Art and Design called Thresholds. This project basically looks at using very simple technology, blob detection. What we're doing with that then is we're measuring contrast within the light within that webcam, and we're drawing contour lines in order to represent that contrast. And so obviously tighter contour lines mean more contrast, wider contour lines mean less contrast. And it's a very simple installation, but the idea is that we get this kind of living topographic model of light within the space. And it's particularly how light affects the surface. And so what ends up happening then is over the course of the day, that contour model begins to build itself and represent the different kind of contrast levels, as well as this kind of disturbance within that field. And so you could use this for anything, but it's I'm saying you could aim this at any kind of surface. In this case, we built this this pattern as a grid to kind of hold that together and then be able to kind of measure the contours off of that. So this uses, I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of speak in metaphor for a second here. This uses kind of all of the simple ways we're thinking about responsive technologies. And that's, we're sensing the environment, we're processing that information. Sometimes we're keeping that in that same loop and continually processing it. And then we're visualizing that. And that visualization might be through imagery, it could be through actuation, it could be a whole range of different pieces. But that composite speaks to just a very small part of how we must interface ecological systems. And it's kind of a single interaction with a much more complex way of looking at the landscape. Continuing to speak in metaphor for the next couple slides, the idea then is that there's this kind of field of data, right? And in order to kind of measure across that field, we can't just grab a point. We have to actually take that point and then maintain a series of decaying relationships to the ecological system. And that series of data relationships becomes important in order to ground that kind of single point. And we're doing that already abstractly through a bunch of different systems. The idea of being able to geolocate ourselves right now already starts to do that physically, but there's a whole series of systems relationships that we're currently still trying to discover. And that begins to then speak to this idea of the feedback loop or the thermostat, which was mentioned, and Hask's conversation theory, and starts to say that begins to evolve, but most importantly that evolution of intelligence actually gets embedded not only in the device, but in the way we start to frame the ecological processes. And those two pieces, which becomes a huge field of continuous feedback loops, all have these kind of interactions with one another. And we begin to plan or curate or nudge the way those interactions occur and the way we cultivate them and the way we let them go. So with that being said, there's a couple other pieces to this. One of them is the way we're sensing data, and I think Charles brought this up earlier, but this kind of idea that GIS would somehow simulate the entire world, which hasn't quite come to fruition. But there's this other concept that our kind of sensing model starts to give us a new picture of the landscape. And it's not necessarily visual, we saw some of that earlier, but it's this data model that's continually evolving in real time. And that we have kind of fragments into that model, and that we need to understand kind of how those fragments situate themselves. All this is talking about is In the Atchafalaya Basin, there's all kinds of, and this is where some of the next work's going to happen in southern, or what I'm going to show you in southern Louisiana. In the basin, there's all kinds of different sensors placed within the basin, and if you actually aggregate that kind of network of sensors, you get a really kind of interesting near real-time picture of how these ecological processes are interacting with each other. And that's a series of geospatial data in terms of imagery. It's localized kind of buoys that are constantly measuring dissolved oxygen, saltwater content, and it's aerial drones that are constantly kind of monitoring different parts of the basin. It starts, for me, begins to build this idea that the landscape becomes not necessarily this, we don't have this kind of all-knowing vision, but we start to be able to map in real time how these systems are actually fluctuating and changing. And instead of kind of abstractly imagining how a single system is working and being forced to kind of relate them, we're actually understanding these kind of more complex models. And similar to how we're altering our bodies, we've for a very long time altered our environment in many different ways. And if we just think of kind of how we've manipulated plant material, my belief is that we will begin to actually alter kind of the interior of these systems. Now, at LSU, we have a much meager kind of way into this. And this is simply using kind of the tools all of the designers are using. In terms of grasshopper and parametric modeling, we're asking students to begin to model or the information they're sensing. And we're typically building these kind of faux ecological systems similar to the river model I showed you before. And asking Grasshopper to then interpret those systems and using Firefly as a way to read those environments. That involves basically setting up kind of different methodologies for measuring kind of single data points, like I was mentioning, dissolved oxygen or saltwater content. It could even be water clarity, water velocity, things like this. But not only imagining kind of how we sense them, but then trying to understand how we might engage them in kind of a larger field. And then ideally coming back to those processes and imagining how, while trying to have some moral implications here, imagining how we might actually alter them and change them in some way, and how how we can have some influence within those processes. I'll go through a couple of these quickly to get to two projects. So, two kind of pushes in this direction. Neither are about spatial design, but they're about how responsive technologies insert themselves within these systems. The first one is this project called PodMod, affectionately known around the school as the dirt sausage, which you'll see in a little while. But the idea with this project is that we have these three zones. This is the Atchafalaya Basin over here on the left, and what's happening in the Atchafalaya is we have this huge amount of water coming down the Atchafalaya River, approximately 30% of the Mississippi at any given time. And the sediment coming through there is basically being deposited all through this kind of middle portion, right? And for effective land building, what we're trying to do is pull all that sediment all the way through the basin and get it out to the mouth of the river, down by down before the continental shelf. Just a few quick facts here. The water flow of the Mississippi, 70% of the water is going down the Mississippi, 30% down the Atchafalaya. But at that kind of moment where they shift, there's a huge amount of sediment coming off of the Mississippi, and almost 60% of the sediment of the river is actually coming down the Atchafalaya Basin. What happens, though, is that in the Atchafalaya, there's several points where that water velocity slows, and the water column slows, and the sediment basically drops out in the basin. And which this adds to kind of all of this extra dredging that needs to occur for navigation, and therefore kind of this idea of conveying that sediment further down the basin. And you'll see here where the name comes from, but the idea is to kind of engage directly in the low sill structure, particularly at peak flow times, and build a series of modular extruders that basically take that sediment, package it in a geotextile, and then float that sediment with some intelligence down the river. And so, sounds crazy, but and actually kind of funny, but all of these projects, not this project necessarily, but many of these projects are actually going forward in terms of basically building land through opening up the river. And conceptually then, we're basically moving that sediment in these kind of silly balloons down the river, allowing them to decay whenever they get, or having a material that decays right when it starts getting near the saltwater line, and then basically building this kind of reef system on the edge of the Gulf. Now, the idea here is that there's a minimal amount of intelligence needed to do that. Basically, you need to keep them together in each volley, and you need to make sure that they kind of maintain a navigation channel, which is actually pretty simple. And a single kind of extruder, if you assume like a 50% loss, would actually move 35 dump trucks of soil to the coast every single day. Okay. So, in the end, then, what we're doing then is we're basically using this conveyance system to push the sediment further down, but also instead of building this kind of large scale, we're kind of basically piggybacking on a large scale piece of infrastructure. But instead of changing that relationship, we're building this system that is slightly more nuanced and can be altered at the kind of object level as opposed to at the kind of megastructure level. And the last project, which I think I have 2 minutes, basically engages, instead of this kind of macro scale version, the micro scale. And in this case, the project makes this assumption that we will continue to have this huge sediment, or nutrient load in the Atchafalaya Basin from upriver, and that nutrient load, many of us probably know this, affects the basins basically by causing extra algae growth, which in its decay basically causes a hypoxic condition. So we have excessive nutrients coming into the basin, we grow tons of algae, that algae decomposes and we end up with this hypoxic condition which robs the oxygen of water. This happens typically during kind of one cycle within the year. And we basically kill off a huge kind of fish population every year. It's a solution. It's a problem that's being solved upstream slightly, but without a lot of success. The concept here, though, is instead of completely relying on this upstream condition, to develop a system that would take that single moment in the ecological process, which is the decay of the algae, and sequester that away from everything else. And so the device that we began to imagine would be the one that would have this kind of large scale of coils that would actually pull up algae-laden water, seal it off, and allow that decay to occur. And the byproduct of that is basically a biogas. And that would then build or fill this structure and basically sequester that kind of whole process away from the actual ecological system. If I go quickly through this, the idea then would be that there would be this kind of new relationship between those two processes, and obviously the object's relying on this kind of length of, or this linear kind of storage system, and basically kind of, basically setting up this condition where we are pulling in this ecology, allowing it to decompose, and then building these structures full of the byproducts. So hopefully that gives some overview of our process.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to respond with an observation and then an anecdote and a question really fast. Observation I realized actually got some watching these two presentations is that maybe there really is a division between landscape architecture and architecture. You described it, you said there's maybe a tenuous sort of relationship between, some presenter earlier called it a thin line between the two. When I'm watching your two presentations, I realized, especially with this coffee pot, with the alfalfa sprouts, is that actually maybe landscape architecture is something you can eat, and you're not going to eat architecture. And how do you imagine this problem of the edge, let's say, in your disciplines? This is the question I'm going to lead up to. Do you mind if I share this anecdote from Gabon? The floor is yours. Great. I took these students to West Africa, this tropical rainforest, a couple weeks ago, and we just got off the airplane and dove right into a rainforest, and we were guided around by a guide through this tropical rainforest. And this is like hour one of the trip. 12 Harvard students and myself walking around this rainforest by this director of a seed bank and arboretum there. And the director started the tour. We stopped at a plant. Director looks at the plant, looks at us, and said, "This here is iboga, and you should all eat it." Now, iboga is one of the strongest drugs that a jungle can produce. It's on the level of ayahuasca or peyote. So you can imagine, as the Harvard instructor, had some reservations about how this tour was going. I said, "Okay, let's get the drugs out of the way first. Let's move on." And the director says, "Okay, let's move on." Goes to the next tree, points to it, and says, "This tree here is great for sex." So you can imagine getting very nervous. Although we did move on. Actually, I'm going to edit out what he followed up that comment on. But he did bring up this issue that the difference between these, let's say, landscape architecture and architecture, and it's really brought up in your presentation in this responsiveness and sensing what's out there, is that we do ingest it, whether we smell it or we drink the alpha coffee. And there's this problem of the edge that both of your projects are revealing. It's the edge between, let's say, an actual nature, which we know is never actually actual or natural, but always authored, and between that edge and, say, constructed landscape, what you're building has all the kind of dynamics and responsiveness of the surrounding context. But then we have a kind of, with this responsiveness, we have a new edge. We have this edge of the observer, who we know with all our tools and with our own biology, we're ingesting these contexts, we're sensing them, and we're even defecating them back out. And I want to maybe end with this little thought model, which has been brought up in our history before, which is the illusionary art of the background in habitat dioramas, like in the Natural History Museum and so forth, between the kind of foregrounding, kind of quasi-natural landscape with the stuffed animals and the dead plants, sometimes live plants, and the background represented, or is a representational backdrop, which is of the skies and the painted landscapes and so forth. And that this problem of the edge is really between those two, right? So how the techniques that they have to accomplish that edge are mechanics, and they are their story, their practices, their techniques. But I wonder if you could both talk about the edges of your project.
The edge meaning the boundary that separates architecture from...
I would say the edge between, between, let's say, the architecture and its context in your project, or even between the kind of sensing and the project itself.
I mean, I would say that some of what I would be arguing for is that that edge isn't necessarily as important, and that edge is insensitive. I'm trying to blur that, and that neither of those ideas, that the constructed and the natural or evolved, whatever you want to call it, both of those have some way of kind of informing one another and evolving with each other. And that's while I don't think the work I'm doing actually gets there, that's the way I imagine that condition, right? And that's why I use that term cyborg. It's not where infrastructure is now in terms of this kind of aesthetic we put on the land to make it perform. It's not performing the way we want it to, but it's this idea that it actually has a sort of symbiotic function back and forth with each other, and that intelligence is embedded in both. So, for me, I'm not building the architecture anyways, but for me, that edge is I'm trying to build actually a person this.
Yeah, now maybe to be clear about that. For instance, the edge of a 60-acre model of the Mississippi Delta within the Delta is an interesting, problematic. I've heard other colleagues like Sanford Quinter describe it this way, like with all the tools and sophistication we have, how do you imagine a body of water inside of water? And I think that's the sort of edge.
But as you mentioned, if one does away with the distinction between the natural and artificial and other kinds of dichotomies, it's hard to think of those two, landscape and architecture, as separate in terms of the object itself. It has to do with the disciplinary apparatus through which you approach them. For instance, like at one point you showed a diagram which was demonstrating how the ecological representation of relations or points in the field and how they are all interrelated and involved. That could have been a representation of one of the sensors on that blanket would actually, and actually how the representation of the whole depended on the modeling of the neighbors, the relation, the interference between one point and the neighbors. So you can shift the scale and suddenly one representation, the same representation holds true for completely different artifacts. Like how the blanket, although you could think of it as a kind of field with a variable self-modeling topography, the blanket is a completely different artifact as an object, yet it can be described in those ecological and as a system of relationships and in terms of topographies, in terms of landscape categories. So I think it's the way, it's the tools that you bring to the analysis that change, that actually reconstitute that boundaries. And sometimes this boundary is blurred. I think we are in an era now actually where there's a lot of creative blurring of this boundary. But you can imagine other disciplinary situations where that boundary may be, where that hard boundary can become a productive strategy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where it gets most production is at that edge, or at that. It's always at the edge between things. Let's say between materials or between temperatures, where disequilibria exists. Anyway, I think that where you find that is where the most exciting opportunities are. Maybe in the interest of time, I'd like to actually pass it over to, you wanted to ask a question, right?
Actually, we can open it to the audience and see
Hi, I just have a question for Brad. Sorry, I singled you out. The cyborg is really first like a heuristic introduced in the social science. It was from like Donna Haraway in particular as a Marxist sexist. I'm sorry, that's funny. Feminist critique, right? To really examine the way in which the machine is embedded in the body, and the body also in the machine. It's a dialectic like that. And I see very much in your work how you're exploring the way the machine or the urban is embedded in the landscape, and how that affects the nature of what is nature and landscape. But to what degree does your work interrogate the way that nature then is embedded in the machine or the urban?
I mean, I think it's completely fair to say that the work I'm showing and the work that I'm doing, the design potentials are really about designing the way these processes interact with each other and understanding kind of how we might have a hand in altering it, and that the kind of relationship to how human beings settle a place or urban form is built, that's very kind of deep and will connection. So, I mean, I would say that that's, I don't know exactly how these kind of come back yet, but I think the idea that we are being able to use them as methodologies for alteration are of most interest to me. And this comes from, I mean, it may be the landscape I'm embedded in now, and the idea that we are altering that kind of on a continual basis for a huge kind of operation in terms of resource extraction or levees on the Mississippi River, and that we're slowly kind of there's some sort of thought process that we're going to somehow return that river back to some preconceived condition of what it was, and that that comes simply from just opening its edges up, right, and something that makes that river what it used to be, and that's good, right? So I guess all I'm saying is that I think that I'm not necessarily addressing that in one way, it kind of gets framed in another way.
Just push a little bit on that. In certain ways, I mean, both projects, but particularly, Bradley, yours, has to do with using differential techniques toward presumably desirable ends. Let's talk about the dirt sausage, right? I mean, phenomenal. Like, the back of my head fell off. And then waiting to see that project for a long time, and having seen it, I can't now not see it, right? You invoked kind of cyborg model. Presumably that's an alternative to other solutions. You could just truck the dirt by dump truck, presumably, and move it where you wanted it to. Or presumably there would be other mechanisms, either more invasive or less invasive. Is the claim that there's something inherently more elegant about the cyborg condition? Or what's the claim of its, is it an efficacious claim? Is it more efficient? Is it...
I think it's less about efficiency. It's not necessarily an argument about efficiency, but it positions the idea that our thinking about infrastructure and our thinking about large-scale kind of regional infrastructure particularly has been monolithic, kind of without a doubt. Our intervention, our management schemes, everything has been about these kind of single data points, and they've been about maximizing that to a very efficient way for that single data point. So if you take the Mississippi River, it's been about protecting land, but it's been also about maintaining one urban condition and maintaining this navigation channel. Everything else to be damned, that's the one condition we maintain, and we do it really well. The idea that I would like to put forward is that there's a kind of bottom-up approach to that, that if we kind of tie into the smaller pieces of how these things form, that we're able to, I mean, it's still about control, so that's part of what I would be saying, that I haven't gotten past that idea, or I don't know if I even have to, but it's still about controlling something, but that we control that at a much kind of finer grain than we do from the other side. And being able to kind of turn off one of those modules, or send as many volleys as we need, or to just say we're not doing it for the next 6 months, that's all possible. And it becomes a much more nuanced way to kind of manage.
In that regard, your project, that one, and the presentation more generally fits. I think it augments very nicely a long-standing discourse about hybridizing infrastructure and asking things to be not singly purposed. And at the same moment, one of the things that's appealing to the model for me is that it avoids the kind of deep ecology, de-dam it, and just let it all go back to Eden. Nor is it a claim necessarily that's redemptive, as far as I understand it. But at the same moment, it's a little bit analogous to medicine or public health, and toward one desirable outcome, you might have surgery, radiation, or pharmaceuticals, and at the same moment, this genre of work, responsiveness, generally tends to privilege or prioritize certain approaches, let's say, and at the same moment, it does certainly advance a conversation on landscape ecology, and I wonder if we aren't running the risk of finding the internal elegance of these narratives themselves appealing. I mean, they are appealing. I find both narratives quite, efficient and elegant. And I mean, with respect to the botanical garden, I mean, presumably this is in response. The scent poles are in response to other, non-responsive, like pre-electronic modes of distributing scent. And it's the irony. I mean, there's something ironic about the relationship between, well, we used to have flower gardens that had a kind of scent dimension or expression, and now we have this.
I want to, in terms of about the previous questions, I still think that it would have to be still about efficiency, in the sense that what I would contrast is optimization versus efficiency. And the large top-down infrastructure is optimized for certain ends, whereas the bottom-up distributed system would be more efficient without optimization. So that's true. So I still, if you're going to speak about elegance, I would hold on to the idea of efficiency.
I think part of that too, though, when we think of the way ecological systems function, we're talking. I think we talk about something broader in terms of ecological fitness, and that doesn't always mean efficiency or even optimization in any single realm. But it talks about kind of this balancing that occurs, and that balancing doesn't necessarily mean that any system functions at its kind of hyper peak, but instead those systems are kind of working at some mid-level in many cases, and when one goes up, something else suffers. And so there's that optimization or that efficiency might be in building a kind of robust fitness as opposed to a single stream of our needs necessarily. And so in a way it becomes this kind of, I guess, relational kind of look into that, right? And as we start to peek into that, we understand kind of this real-time change that would be occurring. I don't have any real kind of thing to point at, but that would be what in the front of my head.
In terms of the digital flowers, specific flowers, well, the real flowers don't blossom during the cold winter, so that's why you need this kind of electronic mediation to start to, in a way, pervert nature as an art. Nature becomes an artifact that you can
a little bit
show
Vegas
more
too.
deliberately.
Our grapes are from Chile this month.
But just following up on this discussion and starting from Ben's remark about boundaries, I'm going to flip the question because these devices, these technologies are helping us blur the boundaries. So it's, they're not about creating boundaries, they're about blurring boundaries. And in the context of landscape design, we're talking about landscape now, and we as human beings were most tolerant to responsive landscapes than responsive structures. And we're used to seeing landscapes evolve and change. So dynamic landscapes are something that's very, we can tolerate that, and we don't necessarily cognitively tolerate architecture that moves around and becomes scary, basically. So in that context, by blurring, keeping that idea basically of blurring the edges, where do you see the potentials of this landscape architecture, starting from the installation scale, but taking it to a larger context, thinking about these boundaries, basically blurring the boundaries. And it's a general question. I'd like both of you to respond if possible.
Well, I would agree with that. Actually, this kind of responsiveness tends to blur the boundaries in the sense that enables architecture to perform more like a landscape in the sense that you can have its temporal qualities could be designed more deliberately, right? So this has always been something taken for granted in landscape, but it's not so evident in architecture, and this technology brings tools that allows you to intervene more precisely and deliberately on those themes, how the architecture evolves through time. In terms of continue the argument, I don't know if it works. In terms of the landscape, it makes it, I think, at least in our work, it's so deliberately introducing the artifice, it makes the landscape become more like an object, like architecture that can be shaped more precisely as an object.
I mean, I guess I maybe I just go off into this edge. Maybe I'm on it. I don't know that. I would say that for me, that kind of insertion is typically it's kind of smaller scale, and that edge for me is the kind of drilling down to kind of what the processes are, and then trying to imagine how they play out as they move up into the scale. And maybe that's the edge that I'm within. That it's not kind of always coming to kind of this end or a solution, but it's really about trying to understand the way the process works and seeing what the intervention causes, right? And that is not a kind of process of building a set of parameters and then saying or imagining what those parameters are and then putting them in place, but it's about typically simulating or pseudo-simulating and then seeing what the result is.
Can I ask a question? No, I'm interested in hierarchy of values because it seems like as designers, to Brad's presentation, that we have to know all this knowledge, we have to explore all this knowledge in order to become better designers. So first I want to understand if that's really true. We are becoming better designers, and what type of tools we need and what type of knowledge we need to become better designers. And second question is, when it relates to your process, the process of investigation, that it's a very scientific process, and when is the moment, or if there's any moment, that we start to envision design, when there's that shift between being a scientist and a designer?
I mean, I would say, so let me answer the second one. If you're talking about the first one. In terms of being a designer, I think that's all I really know, to be honest with you. And the science aspect of it is, for me, is through the lens of a design. I have maybe a fascination with that scientific end of things, but at the same time, I'm immediately wanting to get into the intervention aspect as opposed to the analysis of the system. So for me, I would say it happens immediately, and that's an important distinction between wanting to understand everything about the system as opposed to wanting to immediately get into how the system functions and how I activate the system itself. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to completely alter it, but understanding my role in the process.
I think it's the amount of information that we receive while we are investigating these things. What is the hierarchy of values? What do you say? You're going to say, okay, I'm just interested in sedimentation or siltation, or meanwhile you are dealing with so many consequences that potentially can guide many different options.
So I think in that regard, your statement about can we ever know enough, that's no. I don't think we can. I think that's something we can always wait for, and that will basically always be stuck in this process of learning. But I think our approach to how we alter these systems has to come in terms of understanding kind of morally what are the kind of downstream issues that we would be causing, and allowing ourselves to build this kind of some sort of nuanced methodology into the way we learn. I don't, I'm saying that abstractly because I don't know the answer to how that works every time, but I think the 2 projects I showed try to speak about ecological interventions in that way, that they're not about changing huge swaths of land necessarily. They're about making this kind of pointed interventions.
Well, I would like to formulate a detailed question, and I would like to start with a description of the situation which leads to this question. If you take a taxi in Southeast Asia, or maybe in the rest of Asia, then the taxi driver is fixing this plastic, kind of plastic container in front of him, and out comes this chemical scent of spring or cherry blossoms or I don't know what. When I'm taking such a taxi with my 2 daughters, then one of them is risking vomiting because she's allergic, and the thing is, it's a chemical coil which is coming out of this plastic container. My question is this what is coming out of your tubes in the car?
Actually, it's a good question, because whenever we have several like scent-based projects, and whenever it's like in a gallery situation, the visitors have to actually sign a form. So it comes up all the time, because some people do have like severe reactions to such chemicals. But I want to add that the chemicals that are used in such devices, but also in the perfume industry in general, are less problematic than the natural ones, because usually they are single ingredients, and they are very simple, they've been studied and better, etc. Whereas natural scents, like let's say a rose, has 130 ingredients, and it's more likely to be allergic to one of those than to the artificially produced chemicals, which are usually a single molecule, because they're cheap. The single molecule are cheap. So my answer is that some people will always have reactions to smell, and I actually have another hat, because where I studied the history of smell for a long time. This is very interesting and convoluted history. So some people will react to smell, but it has nothing to do with the problem is not about the chemical basis or natural basis. It has it's a different problem. It's not. It doesn't. I don't think that the chemicals are necessarily more toxic than the natural substances. But actually, in 2 cities already in Canada, they have passed laws that prohibit the use of artificial like cologne fragrances in public because of this one. So I think we are on the verge of a cultural transformation where, like, just like smoking disappeared from public spaces, I think eventually there's a new heightened awareness, like the threshold of tolerance to the perfume is changing, also may generate more and more reactions to it.
Brad, I'm aware of a recent book whose title is Hack the Planet, which is an argument about understanding the very large issues that may be related to nitrogen flow and begin to intervene in them ways. I like your characterization of yourself as a designer, and I thought, well, why didn't they call the book Redesign the Planet or Engineer the Planet? And hack, of course, has a meaning in our culture these days, and especially in the context of the digital. And do you think that the skills for the 21st century landscape architects are going to be substantially different from the last one in ways that your characteristic of the education that you got that changed you into, let's call you a hacker for the moment? And is that an important part, or is that an irrelevant piece of this evolution of the skills that are needed?
I mean, I don't know about it for everybody, but for me, yes, I think it is an important part of what we need. I mean, I'm not saying we all need to we need to be programming, and that's an essential tool. But I think unpacking these ecological processes and understanding kind of how we're deconstructing them and how the components actually fit back together is an important part of us as being landscape architects. I mean, it's a part of the curriculum and pedagogy I'm pushing at LSU, and how we not only represent these systems, but have access to them as designers, so that we can make significant change. Yeah, I do believe it's an important tool set. That's kind of very beginnings of where that's going though, and I can't really set forth a framework for how that all occurs or what's most important and what's least important. My foray into it is in terms of matching, as I showed you with that's why I wanted to show that illustrating ecologies course, is matching kind of the kind of scientific jargon, the kind of visual representation of what we see based on some sort of systems model, and then how the digital tools sit within that realm. And there's no answer in that. I have no answer in all of that other than saying that by placing all three of those there, we begin to have some sort of discourse between what works in each situation, what is real, what is measurable, what is informative, what along those lines.
I'd be really interested in also in Ben's response to this as well.
I'm super interested in that. I mean, let me just say that I don't believe that advanced architecture is needed. I don't really believe that algorithms are the essential. I mean, there's almost this kind of ecclesiastical kind of belief in them right now. But that all these issues are vital. What they bring about is this need to undermine or this need to break things down. As you say, this is what I want to back up. The computation's role fundamentally is that it breaks things down into ones and zeros. Let's say, just a kind of very simple. We all understand that it's binary, and when you break things down into parts, you're doing two things with computation. One, you're setting up a module, but you're also allowing that module to speak. Like you added this RFID tag to a brick. So when things become about parts and language, they have this capacity to one to regenerate and reorganize themselves, but also other things like institutions and boundaries and types and things that up until now we would have maybe seen as slow in their evolutions. So when you talk about design, or when you're asked like what is the difference between, say, a scientist and a designer? Well, it's to me it's about specificity. I mean, you look at a rock. I mean, a rock is formed by the specificities of its environment, along with the kind of internal, let's say, makeup of its crystal substance. So, how those specificities occur, that's when something is nuanced, when you read the kind of external pressures, but when the kind of internal exists within it, and that's kind of, I think, how design exists within this milieu.
I'm from the situation that cringes when I have to use the word research to describe my work. We have to, because this is the nomenclature of the university. This is what they want to see in grant applications. This is the name of the research unit. But I don't think that what we do is research. It's really design.
Yeah.
And this is how it's different. It's not research, it's applied research perhaps, but also it's very much about using research through a design method or a design method. So I still hold on to the idea of the design as an exploratory mode of operation. Science always.
We have time for one more quick question, or if there are no questions, we can Okay, so we can end this session. Thank you all.
Anita has a very long list. Many conclusions.
No, not really conclusions. It's been an extraordinary day. I mean, I think that is perhaps the first obvious thing to say. So thank you, Charles and Moisen and Sylvia, because my first reaction is that it's a brave new world. And we are literally on the verge of
Brave new world.
Yeah.
It sounds scary.
No, it is the kind of specificity of the work presented here today really opens up a whole new set of potentialities, emergent practices, and ways of understanding how to go beyond the digital and the ecological into the social. And that to me has been especially important. This, what Moisen is making fun of, it did take a lot of notes today, but I was trying to separate out some persistence themes, say, and new issues that either return or come up as a result of the digital world. Persistent themes, obviously representation. You know, what and at what scale has been constantly being brought up, whose voices have been represented, and for what purposes, for whom does one map, and then finally, what are the tools that not only blur boundaries but reconstitute categories. So a second persistent theme in terms of design, materiality and making, modeling, material intelligence. These are age-old questions. Does one, going back to representation, represent the effect of the thing or the thing itself? This is something that became very clear with David and Karen and Keith's presentation. The question, and of course related to this, the question of the index and the trace, outside processes that inform and deform material and how we register that. A fourth recurring persistent theme, the question of morphology, figuration, and modeling as a kind of testing as opposed to the end game, what we may call compositional. Of course, out of the question of ecology and the digital, the question of adaptability, of modeling, the question of evaluation. How do we, as designers, look at what we're doing and decide, make decisions in terms of its appropriateness, expression, etc. And then, of course, a question of practice brought up by Care, and by Sylvia, hierarchy of values, and is it science or design? We have really seen, I think, the entire spectrum today, from performative, small scale to large scale, the formal, the visual, the simulation, the heuristic, from scented therapeutic gardens to sediment transporting bombs, devices, I mean, extraordinary. you know, it really makes me think that perhaps it's a good thing that landscape had a late start in all of this, because we're doing it much better. And I understand it comes from the voice of landscape architecture. But I have studied architecture as well, and I'm a big fan of it. And questions of, so new issues that are generated or perhaps come back into the conversation. Of course, a very old one, the question of ornament, the things that are necessary versus the things that are discursive. And this is particularly refreshing to me because the question of ecology and the digital has always returned to us in a very positivistic way. And now it's beginning to be posited as something that has the potential of something else. The Scented Garden, to me, was also very interested in this way, not only because the way plants get produced industrially usually, as they favor disease resistance and form and perhaps blooms and colors, they in fact work against the production of scent. So the question of technology as a complement or something that has been lost is really important. It also reminds me, in fact, of the Villa d'Este and how water regulates temperature there. And it is about 10 to 20 degrees cooler in that garden, which has also regulated the fountains and the output of water. And it would be a really interesting place to measure using this technology. The question of the digital, Joshua Mosley brings up, that counts on the question of this gap as a place for the production of subjectivity. Was a complete surprise to me, because in this kind of positivistic world we've been living on, we have not really talked about the digital as a humanist project, as something that can really reinsert interpretation that counts, in fact, on the space that is not described, what he said as the gap, as something that would generate and in fact that counts on the receiving subject for its completion, for its coming into being. The question of the hyperreal that was brought by Jorg's presentation, I was in fact extremely moved by that technology, because about 10 years ago I was working with slums, doing studios in very, very poor slums in Ciudad Juarez as well as in Venezuela. And we did not have that technology. And the things that we mapped were not, in fact, landscape things, but the things that people needed in order to survive. Ice, for instance, was one. Places to wash clothes, to do the laundry was another one. And so the problem was that mapping, as is known in the West, takes away the possibility of mapping differences. And that tool that you showed us today is all about knowing and inserting, and therefore being able to work with differences, different criteria of survival, the criteria that is embedded in a social situation. And so the only thing I could think about was how our mapping would have been facilitated by that, something that was done very much from the ground up, but always also very socially grounded. And I think far from being worried about how realistic it is, perhaps it is in terms of landscape, but it has a potential for freedom in terms of social representation that is very compelling. Let's see, what else? I think I already talked about intuition, room for discovery in terms of the gap that Joshua had mentioned, but also David Ma talked about this, and how, in fact, in his process of working, there is a moment where the thing itself being produced speaks back, and how there is, in fact, room for discovery, and for adjustment, and for changing, perhaps, the hierarchy of the representation as one discovers how the thing operates and responds to phenomena. Let's see. I think if anything, we talk mostly about production and not so much about the reception of the work, and perhaps this is a direction where this could be moving on into the future. Another topic for, I think, that is raised here is the potential for this work to in fact reverse infrastructures, or the effects of singular infrastructures, and this was brought up by Brad's presentation in a very interesting way. I think I will leave it at that.
I think it's...
I will keep my other notes.
You're going to save those for publication, right?
But thank you again. I mean, it was a wonderful, extraordinary day.
Thanks for doing that. Let me just do that, and I'll close this out. So, thank you so much, Anita, for that. That was very kind, very thoughtful of you to close us out. I want to thank all of our speakers, our respondents, our moderators, and everyone else for joining us today. And in particular, I think we should thank Sylvia Benedito for doing all the work.